Okay, so what are the implications of H bar or what's called Planck's reduced constant used in quantum physics? It becomes a limit. It's taken to the limit as zero to transfer quantum mechanics back into classical physics. But as Basil J. Hiley points out, that this ignores the Planck's constant squared, which then has the quantum potential in this hidden in the non-commutative phase space that is also called like a pre-space or a subalgebra. It is an algebraic process that's non-local of the future and the past overlapping. So the irony is that in music we think of frequency as what in physics is called linear frequency. So if you look at Planck's constant, for Planck's formula for energy, it is the Planck's constant times the linear frequency, or what's called nu with the Greek symbol. But in the reduced form of Planck's constant, the linear frequency is converted to angular frequency based on radians, and this changes the frequency to be directly proportional to the velocity as momentum, because now instead of a cycle based on like the sine wave, you have just a circle for the angular frequency, and so the frequency is basically the same as the velocity. And there's a great video I just watched that explains this well. So I'll give the link in the video description. So then he says in the video, well, this causes confusion because in the linear frequency you have cycles per second, because again you're having this like a sine wave form that is one cycle as the phase, and then that gets converted to radians as the cycle based on the angle. Now, what he doesn't discuss in the video is that when you have the linear frequency based on the cycles per second, that in fact the seconds can't just be canceled out as Planck did when he converted the Planck's constant to joules as energy. He just canceled out the cycles per second, so he just had the frequency. And so the problem is that when you have the cycle, that the cycle as a phase is a non-commutative phase. And so when you include the transition frequencies, as Heisenberg was studying in the Ritz-Rydberg spectroscopy, then you realize that they're non-commutative, and so that changes the cycles per second. So you can't just cancel it out directly, because the exponentials are non-commutative when you invert them. And this is actually the secret truth of music also. In other words, when you change the direction of the measurement, it changes the value. And so in quantum physics, this is becomes the anti-commutator as the Baker bracket or Jordan product. So it's in the matrices. But again, the Planck's constant in the reduced form is then taken to the limit as 0. So what for the commutator? So when you convert it back to classical physics, what you're doing is you have the uncertainty principle between position and momentum. So you're assuming that what's not on the inner product as the diagonal of the matrices is all 0, when in fact it's a non-local, non-commutative phase with the position. So the inner product would be the momentum as the velocity as a transition frequency. And then the rest of the matrix would be all zeros because of the reduced Planck's constant as an angular frequency that no longer has a cycle. But the non-commutative phase space shows that the cycle is asymmetric time. So the phase, when the phase flips over, it becomes out of phase as an asymmetric time shift due to the imaginary number as a negative frequency. And so in normal quantum mechanics, in order to get the position, you're squaring the amplitude, which is the height of the wave, the cycle, in order to get the position of the particle. And when you square it, then you're canceling out the negative frequencies. But if you're using the linear frequency based on the cycle, then when you change the phase, it's inverse to the frequency. And so what Louis de Broglie realized is that due to relativity, when you have Planck's constant, then the energy is Planck's constant times frequency, but based on relativity, the energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And so when you combine them together, then you get what Louis de Broglie called the law of phase harmony, which means that as a particle increases in momentum, the frequency goes up from quantum physics. But due to relativity, as it goes towards the speed of light, the time also gets bigger. And since the frequency is inverse to time based on music theory ever since Pythagoras, therefore, if both of those things are true, then logically there has to be a time reversed negative frequency that is then considered to be guiding the particle as a pilot wave or non-locality. Now, since it's unobservable, then normally it's considered to be canceled out as a, and it's not energy. But what the difference between de Broglie realized in the 1960s that it's not actually a guidance. It's not a guidance wave. It's not a pilot wave because there's no medium for it. Because if you call something a wave, there has to be a physical medium. And so what the non-commutative phase space is showing us that this is just an active information that Roger Penrose called proto-consciousness, or he calls it proto-consciousness from Bernard d'Espinal, a French name. So the proto-consciousness is this non-local, non-commutative phase space that Basil J. Hiley is using Clifford algebra to explain it, and so you get the future and the past overlapping before the particle exists, and this is what creates matter. It's the origin of matter is from this non-local process. Now, what they also discover is that this is the basis of anti-gravity, because it's what Roger Penrose explains is that the source of mass is actually from this negentropy or negative entropy of the negative frequency. And he points out that this causes a inconsistency with the weak equivalence principle in general relativity, because you have essentially two different quantum vacua, and that's not allowed in order to have a rest frame for the speed of light invariance. And so the quantum non-locality has this, what Roger Penrose calls negative resonance, which is a negative frequency time reversed resonance. And because it's non-commutative, it's not limited to the Planck scale. So the Planck reduced constant is not the scaling factor, but rather the what was called h bars, Planck's reduced constant. It's actually this non-commutative phase space that is the new scaling factor, and what Alain Kahn calls 2-3 infinity. So you take what was previously the Heisenberg uncertainty principle with the imaginary number, then times the position and the momentum, and then you have, instead of Planck's constant, you have this non-commutative phase. You don't have a reduced form of Planck's constant. So you can also think of Planck's constant as the average energy of light, but normally, again, since the reduced form of Planck's constant is reduced to zero, in order to convert the quantum operators into the classical commutators for the Poisson bracket, this is no longer true when you're dealing with the Jordan product or the Baker bracket as the anti-commutator. it originates from this non-commutative phase space of the transition frequencies of, time and frequency. And so this is the secret of anti-gravity, but also if you look at, like, there's studies on non-commutativity as what they call non-commutative coherence. And non-commutative coherence is a deeper non-local coherence than quantum coherence. And so then it self-amplifies to the macro scale. And this is what Pascual Jordan understood in the 1930s. And it's what they were searching for with their supposed Bell anti-gravity experiments with this Bell technology, using a mercury as a superconducting plasma, as this like relativistic plasma. But it turns out that just cancels gravity. So it's not the same as what Pascual Jordan originally had realized as the secret of non-commutativity as the origin of life on Earth, from the same negentropy that powers the sun. So the source of the fusion energy of the sun is due to this gravitational potential energy that originates. That's what Penrose calls dark energy. He says dark energy is this gravitational potential energy that's actually negentropy, quantum frequency, negentropy, or negative entropy. So you have the Louis de Broglie law of phase harmony that's non-commutative. So you have this negative frequency and time reversed signal that's a non-commutative coherence that then self-amplifies from the future. And since it does it through this algebraic process that is quantum algebra. So it's also explained by basic music theory. If you understand, as Alain Kahn says, this is a simple, intuitive notion. But the problem is that people get brainwashed by the classical physics that assumes a symmetric commutative geometry using irrational magnitude, and that arose from the wrong music theory, starting with Platonic philosophy from Archytas and Philolaus, and then picked up by Newton, and so and then extended by Einstein. And what my own physics professor Herbert J. Bernstein he has a newly published book chapter. It's a couple years ago, but they devised a study of a single photon using a frequency down conversion, where they proved that Einstein was wrong, because he was assuming that quantum theory has to have multiple particles for the quantum statistics to then the probability to be applied as a collapse of the wave function. But what Herbert J. Bernstein has proven is that you actually have this. It's the same thing as Bell's inequality, where you can have a non-locality just with one photon. So if you then take that secret to based on the weak measurement experiments where they're using entangled photons, then they're realizing that there is a secret gravitational mass to the photon that's actually in the imaginary negative frequency time reversed non-commutative coherence. And so that's the secret of anti-gravity, that as the source of life, of being alive, that Roger Penrose calls proto-consciousness. And that's Basil J. Hiley then says, if you stay in this non-commutative coherence, there's no need to use any wave function, and there's no quantum collapse of any wave function, so there's no quantum measurement problem. And you can just keep scaling it up if you can maintain the non-commutative coherence. That this is what is done in meditation to then build up the energy, and then space-time itself is created from that negentropic, negative entropy, gravitational potential, from the negative frequency, time reversed, non-locality. So then this is, what Lee Smolin calls fundamental time. He was a student of the same Herbert J. Bernstein professor that I had in quantum physics. And then Roger Penrose uses that same phrase, fundamental time. And then if you think of the imaginary number as just a time shift of 1 and -1, as Luke Hoffman explains, then if you have, essentially I equals I over -1, then you have this, what becomes a time as an iterant and an asymmetric time shift process, because each time you make an external measurement, it takes time to make the measurement. And therefore, time is a physical, empirical truth of reality that changes the mathematical value to be non-commutative. That is the secret of the non-commutative phase space, is that source of the I, the imaginary number is time. So it's what Roger Penrose calls the time cubed phase space, but it's non-commutative. And so that's the weak equivalence principle then originates out of that energy non-local process. And so Penrose is arguing that if you do have a collapse of the wave function, it's caused by the buildup of the energy that then causes this sense of linear time and gravity as an external measurement. And so the Dirac spinner, Penrose had argued that that's more fundamental than space-time, but Basil J. Hiley has pointed out that Dirac, he was neglecting this Planck's constant squared, and therefore neglecting the non-commutativity